we'll have two major points of discussion. One is what are the ethical principles that guide medical research now, and also what is the informed consent process? What are the components of those, of this process, and what forms are there, and what are the responsibilities? So as I mentioned to you, humanity, unfortunately, fairly often goes through painful experiences before it can synthesize some principles and try to avoid mistakes. One of the biggest mistakes of the 19th century was, the world wars that occurred, and in particular, World War II was very gruesome. Probably way better than I, that a lot of population was, tortured and prosecuted and killed, among them Jews, Poles, Roma, mentally and physically disabled people were subjected to a lot of cruelties, unnecessary, heinous acts in the camps. In order to get some, justice back, there was a trial that happened in German city of Nuremberg. And that's why the code is known with that name, the Nuremberg Code. And then it's also known as the doctor's trial. So 20 doctors were tried for the experimentation in the camps. One of those doctors is here. His name is Karl Brandt. He happened to be a neurosurgeon by training. It's fairly accepted by historians that without his tacit approval, none of those would have, heinous acts would have happened. He got sentenced by hanging, and that's kind of one of the outcomes of the trial. As I mentioned, the acts were unspeakable. They were, mutilation acts, they were sterilization, they were, purposeful infection with typhus, with malaria and other diseases, poisoning, giving people to drink salt water, et cetera, you name it. So because of the deliberations that, the judges had to do during that trial, they came up with 10 principles that so that hopefully humanity doesn't ever live through this nightmare. So what are the 10 principles in the Nuremberg Code? First of all, research has to be voluntary, so voluntarity of consent. Second of all, the experiments have to be faithful and good for the society. There should be some previous knowledge stemming from, animal data before experimentation is done on humans. Absolutely physical and mental suffering has to be avoided, and death and disability injuries cannot be induced outcomes. Risk should not exceed the humanitarian importance of research. There should be adequate preparation in terms of facilities, and the actual researchers who are doing this should be educated and scientifically qualified. Human subjects have the liberty to stop participation at any time point. And finally, investigators should be ready on their end to also terminate the study at any time point should results cause injury, disability, or death. So these are the 10 principles of the Nuremberg Code. They were then used in additional guidelines. For example, there's a Declaration of Helsinki, which is guiding also a lot of research with many reiterations of this declaration. And then, unfortunately, this sort of history happened across the ocean, but that is to say, we on this side of the ocean are not protected from making mistakes. And so that brings me to the next slide, where some of you also know about this chapter in American history, where a small city in Alabama, the city, it's not a city, I think it's a town of Tuskegee, was chosen for a natural history study of syphilis in about 400 poor and untreated African American men. The participants were told that They are being treated for something called bad blood. That was a very non-specific term to mean fatigue, anemia, and included sexually transmitted disorder, syphilis. They were offered in exchange for their participation free meals and burial insurance. But the big controversy with this episode of American medical history is that the study continued despite approval of a drug uh, curing syphilis in 1947. And if you see here, that experiment continued until 1972, so 25 years after the discovery of penicillin and approval of penicillin for treatment of syphilis. The study continued, and those men went being untreated, which in itself led to also unspeakable human suffering in terms of, infecting their wives, giving birth to children with congenital syphilis, things that could totally have been prevented. Not only that, the way this study ended is also notable. It wasn't ended by the researchers themselves. What needed to happen, um, of course, those participants were not told that they have syphilis. I told you that the word that was used was bad blood, and nor were they treated for it. But the way the study ended was actually by a whistleblower leaking information about this study to the New York Times, and then the New York Times published information, an article on that, and that led to a massive, outcry in the community. And of course, this was conducted by a government agency, and this government agency should have and could have protected those people between 47, after 47. So that's kind of the sad chapter on this end of the, of the ocean. Of course, we need to learn from mistakes, and we need to kind of implement better safeguards. So the better safeguards came in three shapes. The Beaumont Report, we'll talk about it. The Office of Human Research Protection was established, and the institutional review boards were established, and we'll talk what exactly they are. So the Beaumont Report was done in 1978. It has three major principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Each one of them has, additional elements. The respect for persons is through autonomy of making your decision, informed consent, truthfulness, and no deception. Then beneficence, that's a principle in medicine from, the time of Hippocrates, when you should do no harm in the first place, and the benefits should outweigh the risks. And justice, reasonable procedures distributed fairly among, the society members. So the institutional review boards, this is an ethical board, which is an independent committee from any kind of, hospital association, hospital affiliation. I mean, they should have, enough autonomy to decide independent of the hospital. It's governed by the Code of Regulations 45, and also the OHRP, the Office of Human Research Protection, is governing institutional review boards across the country. Every institution who is doing human research has not only one, but big institutions like, big university have at least several institutional review boards in order to handle all the research requests. There should be representation of, the members at large, not only of medical personnel and not only of physicians, but many other, professions, pharmacists, nurses, speech pathologists, different kind of medical specialists participate in the boards. And in terms of members of the public, we've had clergymen, we've had, lawyers, we've had engineers, different kind of backgrounds. People from different background can be members of the IRB boards. So in particular, the safeguards, as we mentioned, include informed consent, where enough information is disclosed to the participant in order to make a decision. That patient or person needs to be having good decision-making capacity. And finally, this has to be done without coercion and voluntary. The institutional review boards themselves are another ethical safeguard because they make sure that the appropriate research, appropriate meaning the one that's safe for the patients, that's good for the society in general, is done. At the same time, the privacy, confidentiality, dignity, and welfare of the patients are protected. The risks are outweighing the benefits, as we mentioned, and that an informed consent form documenting the informed consent process is filled. And then there are other agencies like the NIH, the FDA. So what exactly is the informed consent? We'll go through a definition, what are the components, the processes, and what is the form, and then what are the responsibilities of both the people doing the research and the people participating in the research. So you will hear occasionally the word subjects, and that's, to mean patients who participate in a research study. So the definition of informed consent is that it's a voluntary agreement based on the adequate knowledge and understanding of relevant information to participate in research or to undergo a diagnostic, therapeutic, or preventative procedure. That is definitely based on information, comprehension, and volunteering. So that's what the informed consent is. When we talk about respect for the autonomy, if you remember one of the principles of the Beaumont Report, what does that mean? That means that a person has the right to decide for him or herself, that a person has the right to information that will help them make that decision. The person has enough time to decide without being coerced, and the person can grasp the information because it's presented in a language and in a level and a word selection that is easy for them to understand. In practical terms, when we talk about information, what is information? Number one, people need to know that this is research. This is not standard of clinical care. They need to know what is the purpose of research, why is it being done. They need to know how long they will be expected to participate. They also need to know what are the plans and what procedures are there that the researchers plan to do. And also they need to know if this is greater than minimal risk. What is there any compensation? When we say something is greater than minimal risk, any kind of new medication that's being studied is considered greater than minimal risk because, of course, it's a new medication. We don't know all the possible, side effects of that medication. So then, is there some sort of compensation available? And then, of course, they need to know that their participation is voluntary and they can withdraw it at any time point. And also, who do they ask questions from? All of these elements are actively being looked for by IRBs when researchers submit the consent form. Is that information part of the IRB consent form? Some additional elements that are also being carefully looked at is the mentioning that at this point in time, researchers, clinicians may not know of some risks. So there may be risks that we are unaware of that should be stated. Also, it should be stated under what circumstances it's possible to ask a participant not to continue in research. And those circumstances can be discussed. Also, in some cases, there may be additional costs associated with the participation. That should also be mentioned. How many people are expected to be enrolled in this project, in the study, and also if there are new findings, now that will ring quite familiar with the Tuskegee experiment, if there are new findings that become available during the research period, how would that impact the participants and their willingness to continue and to share that information, the research information with them? So informed consent is not a document. That's what some, people, on first pass think. It's a process. It's a continuing dialogue, which begins at the time when the researcher or the clinician mentions to you there is a study. So that's the beginning of that consent process. There should be, as we mentioned, sufficient time to review the consent and to answer the questions. Exactly what Terry mentioned before. Some people, they've made up their mind. They already know they want to do the research, but nevertheless, we really want the participants in the study to read what is there in the informed consent. And we oftentimes have the practice of sending you the informed consent ahead of your, time when we'll be actually meeting you in the research setting, so that you had ample time. You could consult, a dictionary if there is a word that bothers you, et cetera, et cetera. And it's dynamic. It's not like a one-time situation that is written in stone and never changes. No, it's, a process. It can go through ups and downs. People can, refuse or stop their participation, and that's fair. Finally, can you hear me? Okay. Finally, when does it end? It ends with the post-study communication, when people share results with you. So what about comprehension? Subjects must be able to understand the information that's presented to them. And usually most IRB levels have a set of words or, that are accepted as easy to understand, common language. That's usually 8th grade level. Information must be adapted if, there's some word, as we said, or expressions that are difficult to understand. And then there must be enough sufficient time. Not only to read the actual document, but also to have this dialogue, to have the back and forth answers and questions. Also, the other important part is that there should be no form of coercion. There should be no physical, no psychological or monetary coercion. Sometimes IRBs spend a lot of time discussing if there will be a compensation for a study. Is that reaching the level of coercion? If that compensation is significant, it may be viewed as a way or form of monetary coercion. So that's another aspect. Another, how do we actually show our respect to people when we go through informed consent? Well, first of all, the person understands what's being asked of him or her. Also, the respect is if the person has the opportunity to ask questions. And finally, the person truly wants to continue with the study. It's not something that he or she does because they want to please their doctor. No, it shouldn't be that way. So what are the basic components? We a little bit talked about those: the purpose, the visits, how many visits, what are the procedures, what are the potential risks, what is the animal and the human data, what are the common side effects, what are the rare serious side effects, the potential benefits. There may be no benefit to a participant since the treatments are experimental by design, and then we should be honest with people and say that. And we always learn something new. And if that's the case, then it may not benefit the current participant in the research, but it will benefit people, patients, families, communities in the future. And then, for example, are available current approved treatments approved under, to be taken under the particular disease group, under the particular disease we're studying? For example, is riluzole, Radicava, BiPAP, etc. allowed? Most studies do that. They do. They it's unethical not to allow people to use FDA-approved studies, medications, and procedures. Then, if there's new information, if something new comes, then we need to inform participants of newly approved treatments. The confidentiality is very important. People get, specific code of letters and numbers such that their first name and last name is not used anymore. Then how is that data stored is important as well, and who has access to this data. We mentioned a little bit about compensation for time. There's also specific language that lawyers are very careful about in terms of medical injury. And then we also mentioned that compensation has to be very reasonable, not to present, a form of monetary coercion. And finally, what is the contact information? What are the questions about, the study? If you have research questions, etc., who do you contact? How do you contact? So all of these sets of data are included. And finally, assuring voluntariness, that you will not lose any benefits. You will not lose your autonomy if you decide not to participate in a study. So the actual form is that legal document that meets all of these elements that we just talked about it. It's kind of like a reminder for you when you go home, you can reread them, you can discuss with family, and it serves you as kind of a basic guide. It provides the documentation and proves that, that sort of conversation happened. It's signed always. Not only that, it's dated, and a lot of times we also put the actual time of the day when it was signed and dated, that it was sometimes witnessed as well, and then copies were given to you as soon as this was done. What about the responsibilities? Safety is the biggest responsibility when we participate in clinical trials. Our biggest concern is, are we doing enough to keep you safe? Ensuring that the patients their rights are protected. We talked a little bit about the safeguards there. And also we have to be compliant with all the laws and regulations that exist, federal, state, and locally mandated laws. So in terms of your responsibilities, for you, it will be important to take as much time as you need to understand all the implications of the research. What exactly is the treatment? What is the benefit risk ratio? Is this concurrent with current medical thinking, with current guidelines? And is the investigator and their staff trained to perform this sort of investigation? And are your questions handled in a way that's satisfactory to you? Are things explained in a way that you can understand? So there are ethical safeguards. We mentioned the major ones, the Nuremberg Code, the Beaumont Report, and the current, safeguards of any research done in this country are the Office of Human Research Protection, the Institutional Review Boards, the Food and Drug Administration. The informed consent is a process in which information, comprehension, and volunteering are the basis. It's a dynamic and ongoing process, and there are shared responsibilities between the patients and the investigators. So thank you very much.